Welcome to Forthright. I'm Sulani Madsen, and this is a reader feedback edition on a column first published January 13, 2022 in the Spokesman Review, following a public hearing at the State Board of Health that morning. Attempts to remove one viral stigma feeds another. Legislation that passed in early 2020 to remove a decades-old stigma clinging to HIV status ran into the novel coronavirus in 2022. In an atmosphere where distrust of authority is endemic, the agenda for this week's Washington State Board of Health meeting went viral on social media. More than 7,500 people requested to make comments at Wednesday's virtual meeting. That would never have happened in the days when testifying at an agency board meeting meant traveling to Olympia. House Bill 1551 was narrowly targeted at changing wording within existing law to refer to blood-borne pathogens instead of HIV/AIDS, reflecting the existence of better therapeutic and preventative measures. In the early years of the AIDS pandemic, fear drove policy. Anyone who was or was thought to be HIV positive was stigmatized, losing opportunities for employment. Concern over the release of private health information like HIV status was one factor leading to the patient privacy laws now known as HIPAA. And now we have mandates from the governor requiring disclosure of private health information as a condition of employment for a virus far less deadly than HIV, and in spite of a growing body of knowledge regarding preventative and therapeutic measures. Testimony made it clear there is very little trust in our one-party government. State boards across all agencies, as well as agency heads, are appointed by the governor. When a single party has had a lock on the executive branch for 3 decades, those boards and appointed agency heads do not reflect the diversity of the state. It is doubtful if the legislature would be so free with delegating rulemaking authority to the executive branch if the executive branch were not captive to the same party. When the legislature passed HB 1551, it directed the Department of Health to update communicable disease rules related to HIV. That distinction between law and rule is significant. The legislature controls the revised Code of Washington. The RCWs delegate often significant rulemaking authority to the executive branch departments and their staff. The rules thus created are codified in the Washington Administrative Code, and it was WAC 246-100-040, Procedures for Isolation or Quarantine, which fed the fever of distrust. Rumors of isolation and quarantine camps have surfaced at various times over the past 2 years. They do exist, but only as voluntary shelter locations for people who are homeless, were living in crowded households and seeking a place to self-quarantine, or for travelers or others passing through the state who needed to self-quarantine and didn't have the means to pay for accommodations. Voluntary isolation is not in question, but the text of WAC 246-100-040 says plainly, quote, at his or her sole discretion, a local health officer may issue an emergency detention order causing a person or group of persons to be immediately detained for purposes of isolation or quarantine, and may invoke the powers of police officers, sheriffs, constables, and all other officers and employees of any political subdivisions within the jurisdiction of the health department to enforce immediately orders given to effectuate the purposes of this section, end quote. It is doubtful many of Washington's elected sheriffs would be cooperative. State Board of Health Chairman Keith Grellner said he was aware that most counties have set up something for voluntary quarantine, and there are lots of examples, but, quote, we can barely fund staffing and structures for those who want it, end quote, and mandatory quarantine facilities don't exist. Quoting Mr. Gellner again, don't know what else we can say. But there's no point pretending WAC 246-100-040 doesn't say what it plainly says. Immediately detained under the police powers of the state is clearly stated. That it has never been used since the rule was adopted in 2003 only means it's never been tested by the judicial branch for constitutionality or reviewed and overruled by the legislature. Earnest statements from the Board of Health at its Wednesday meeting are not reassuring to those who have little trust in the executive branch. It doesn't mean it couldn't be used or abused by a governor with no check and balance on his emergency powers. It's a bad rule. There are 2 ways the Board of Health and the legislature could act to restore that trust. the legislature could pass a bill to repeal WAC 246-100-040 and direct the Board of Health back to work on rulemaking with more specific instructions to protect individual rights and freedoms. Or the legislature could pass one of the bipartisan pre-filed bills providing for significant checks and balances by the legislature on any future governor tempted to declare a never-ending emergency. Social media's ability to take viral the agenda of a previously sleepy executive branch board meeting is another kind of citizen check and balance on government power. A state Board of Health technical advisory working group is just beginning to research the pros and cons of requiring COVID-19 vaccination for children in order to enroll in public school. Based on the public comment at today's meeting, the public pressure will not be letting up. Now, in a press conference following the State Board of Health meeting, Governor Inslee blamed Republican misinformation for the high level of interest in this board meeting. In truth, the problem was a vague agenda written for insiders, the way state boards used to be able to operate, when nobody but insiders were paying attention. And since when is citizen participation in government something to be dismissed as problematic? Isn't that the point of having democratic processes? COVID changed everything. It's not just interested lobbyists from both sides following agendas. Now citizen activists are reading them too. Given the lack of transparency and decisions out of the executive branch over the last 2 years of one-man rule, it should surprise no one when some of those citizens assume the worst. And as everyone who has ever played a childhood game of telephone, the message unravels with every telling. And so, thousands of people attended what used to be a quiet meeting in Olympia. We've come to expect full access online to every public meeting and hearing anywhere in the state at any time. And that's progress. It's uncomfortable for a bureaucracy not used to such public scrutiny, but it's progress for those in favor of more open government. It provides a citizen check and balance on agency actions. And that's why the newly discovered and read WAC 246-100 caused such a kerfuffle. Without any check on the governor's power after the governor declares an emergency, there is little trust in how that power may be wielded. While surely it is unlikely, it is indisputably true that the Department of Health does have, or claims to have, the power that at the direction of the governor in an emergency, they can call for involuntary detention and quarantine. Now, to be clear, I don't believe the rule was adopted in 2003 for nefarious purposes. It is possible for there to be a communicable disease outbreak serious enough to warrant isolating a community with that outbreak. Something with a recovery rate like Ebola, with a case fatality rate of up to 90%, according to the WHO. And even that rate can be brought down to a 50% recovery rate with prompt diagnosis and treatment. On the other hand, the current coronavirus, still being used as a reason for an emergency declaration, has a survival rate of between 97% and 99.75%, according to WebMD. Still a difficult thing to calculate since testing is so spotty. And meanwhile, in South Africa, where the Omicron virus was identified, the National Institute for Communicable Diseases recently estimated a recovery rate of 93% in a country where only 27% of the population is fully vaccinated. Coronavirus is not a zombie apocalypse. There's a huge difference between disease with a 10 to 50% survival rate and one with a 93 to 99.75% survival rate. And here's why checks and balances on emergency power matters, as told in an email from a retired Spokane County deputy sheriff and a former SWAT commander. And I realize I'm reading this, leaving him be anonymous, because I didn't have a chance to ask if he had a problem with repeating this with his name attached. I'll have to ask him that. What this man says is, in the late 1990s, I attended a tabletop exercise that involved a response to an infectious disease that had been identified in a neighborhood. I can't recall if it was due to biological weapon use or a natural occurrence, and that doesn't matter. What matters is the direction I was given by a health officer involved in the exercise. My team was assigned perimeter control of the neighborhood. I asked the health district, who was the incident commander of the exercise, what actions we should take if people tried to leave the perimeter. This was a serious question. Is it safe to put hands on? What kind of PPE do we need? Do we have a place to take them? After all, this was not the probable cause arrest we in law enforcement dealt with regularly. He responded with zero thought, saying, "Shoot them," and meant it. He and I then had a vigorous discussion related to WAC 246-100-040 and his authority to give me orders such as the one he had just given. Our discussion ended when I bluntly explained to him that he did not have the authority to order me and my team to use force, especially deadly force, and if that was his expectation, he could expect me not to assist if a similar biological incident ever did occur. There must be checks and balances in place. Before the point of a governor, one person, having the authority to empower a public health officer to order a deputy to use deadly force for violation of a quarantine order, or to order involuntary detention without due process or probable cause. Then just today, as I was preparing this edition of Forthright, I received a press release out of the legislature from the office, from the House Democrats. Senator Emily Randall, Democrat of Bremerton, today introduced a bill to strengthen Washington State's checks and balances on gubernatorial powers during a state emergency. So finally, we are going to see in the state legislature a debate over what's an appropriate check on emergency powers. The press release goes on to say Senate Bill 5909 would add legislative oversight to declarations of states of emergency and prohibitive emergency orders during legislative interim. The pandemic made it clear, and this is a quote from Senator Randall, "The pandemic made it clear to my neighbors and to Washingtonians in every corner of our state that our current system of government gives a lot of power to one person in the executive branch in times of emergency," said Senator Randall. And if the legislature isn't in session during a declared emergency, there is no opportunity for legislators to make sure the concerns and priorities of our communities are a part of the decision-making process. Senator Randall goes on to write, "Emergencies affect whole communities, and in the case of this pandemic, this emergency has affected our entire state. We will recover better together, more equitably, and more quickly when a body of duly elected legislators acting in direct service of our communities can be a part of that recovery. Right now, during interim, it's up to one person, the governor. This bill aims to fix that," end quote. Senate Bill 5909 would empower the 4 members of the leadership of the Washington State House of Representatives and Senate to terminate a state of emergency. If the legislature is not in session and 90 days have passed since the state of emergency was declared by the governor, it would also allow for the termination of prohibitive emergency orders if the legislature is not in session and 90 days have passed since the emergency order was established by the governor. It's a good start, and it's going to be a good debate to have and one to follow, one that you can follow online, live on tvw.org. Let your representatives in the legislature know if you're interested in emergency powers reform. Ask them to support a vigorous debate on Senate Bill 5909, and because it's time to start rebuilding trust in government responsible to the people. Thank you for joining me on this edition of Forthright. You're invited to subscribe to Forthright on Spokane Talk's YouTube channel or on my own Substack page at substack/Sulani Madsen to stay up to date on future editions of Forthright.